The first successful European colony in America was Jamestown, which was founded in 1607. The immigrants who came most likely became farmers and were indentured servants, meaning that a slightly more wealthy colonist would fund their voyage in return for a certain amount of work. These early colonists were mostly British, German, and Dutch. They relied on tobacco and later other cash crops to sustain themselves. They often faced high death rates as well as the spread of disease or starvation. Immigrants seeking religious freedom colonized the New England area. The first of their settlements was Plymouth, founded in 1620. These immigrants were usually British, more educated, and skilled. They had a higher birth rate and a more independent lifestyle. By the 1700s, there were 1,500,000 colonists living in the colonies. By now, a new way of life had begun, and a unique culture emerged. Colonists moving in after the early 1700s had to work harder to earn their place in society. A famine in Ireland in 1740 brought thousands to America. There was a strong anti-Irish sentiment in America and elsewhere. They were usually farmers in the frontier or indentured servants. The 1790 Act limited naturalization to free white persons only. Slaves had been in American life since Jamestown, but the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made their place permanent. They were brought over in the triangle trade and were seen as foreign or outside of the system since they were not European. By 1800, almost 900,000 slaves lived in America.
Nearly 12 million immigrants arrived in the United States between 1870 and 1900 alone. Most of the immigrants during this time came through the main immigration stations on the coast of America, such as Ellis Island on the east coast and Angel Island on the west coast. Hundreds, mainly British, Irish, and German immigrants came to the United States. During this time, many were fleeing from famine and religious persecution. The Irish potato famine caused massive starvation in 19th century Ireland, and it led to large-scale immigration to the United States. In addition, most immigrant groups that formally come to America by a choice that seemed distinct had many similarities. Most had come from Northern and Western Europe. Most had some experience with representative democracy. With the exception of the Irish, most were also Protestant. Many were literate, and some possessed a fair degree of wealth. These were called the Old Immigrants. Once settled, immigrants looked for work. However, there were never enough jobs. Employers often took advantage of the immigrants due to this. Men were generally paid less than other workers, and women less than men. Most were swept up by political machines, which would offer jobs and places safe for political support. Despite the horrors of tenement housing and factory work, many still agreed that the wages they could earn and the food they could eat surpassed their former realities. Still, about 25% of the European immigrants of this time never intended to become American citizens. These birds of passage simply earned enough income to send their families and return to their former lives. Social tensions were also a part of the immigrant experience. Often stereotyped and discriminated against, many immigrants suffered verbal and physical abuse because they were different. For example, the Chinese were seen as women-like because they took women's jobs by cooking and cleaning because that was the only jobs available to them. While large-scale immigration created many social tensions, it also produced a new vitality in the cities and states in which the immigrants settled. The newcomers helped transform American society and culture, demonstrating that diversity as well as unity is a source of national strength. The mid to late 19th century saw mainly an influx from southern and eastern European countries as well as from other Asian countries. These immigrants, called the new immigrants, were not welcomed in the United States. While factory owners greeted the rush of cheap labor with zeal, laborers often treated their new competition with hostility. They were therefore seen as a threat to American societies. Criminals, contract workers, the mentally ill, anarchists, and alcoholics all were among groups to be gradually barred from entry by the Congress. Most immigrants also suffered even worse discrimination during the late 1800s. In the late 1800s, followers of Dennis Kearney, called Kearneyites, began to harshly discriminate against Chinese that immigrated because of the gold rush and economic opportunity. They protested against Chinese immigration in California, and eventually these natives successfully restricted the flow of immigration. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring this ethnic group in its entirety. 25 years later, Japanese immigration was also restricted by this executive agreement. These two Asian groups were the only ethnicities to become excluded from America.
The early 1900s saw some improvement for immigrants as muckrakers exposed the unsanitary conditions of both urban housing and workplaces. The presidents of the Progressive Era, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, all made attempts to better the living conditions of immigrants through various legislation. In California, the population of Japanese hugely increased after the Russo-Japanese War, forcing many to immigrate to California. After some controversy, Theodore Roosevelt settled the issue with the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, where Japanese agreed to stop sending laborers. Later, California legislature tries to prevent the Japanese from owning land, although Wilson stopped this proposal in 1913. World War I also saw an increase in immigrant prejudice as Americans began to see Germans as the enemy, harassing and discriminating against them. In one case, a German in Illinois was lynched. Also in 1917, a literacy test for immigrants that had been vetoed by 3 presidents before finally passed, further closing the United States immigration. 1920s isolationism can clearly be seen in the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which reduced the number of immigrants that could come from one nationality, and the Immigration Act of 1924, which made the original even more strict. These two acts brought an end to a period of almost unrestricted immigration where 35 million people came to the United States. Another case of prejudice can be seen in the Sacco and Vanzetti case of 1921, where 2 immigrants were charged with the murder of a paymaster. The judge and jury were all prejudiced against Italians, convicting the men without a fair trial. The KKK also re-emerged in the 1920s, this time targeting immigrants and foreigners, as well as blacks. The 1930s saw a huge amount of Jews fleeing the Holocaust and heading to America, although few were let in due to strict quotas. One ship, the St. Louis, was forced to return to Europe with 900 refugees after being denied entry. Immigrants during the 1930s also widely supported Roosevelt and his New Deal, believing that it would elevate their position in life and better their conditions. During World War II, Roosevelt called for the internment of 110,000 Japanese, continuing West Coast prejudice against the nation. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the relocation in Korematsu versus the United States. Also in 1942, the Braceros program brought thousands of agricultural laborers from Mexico to work with the United States. Not all supported these Hispanics, however, as seen in the 1943 Zoot Suit riots, where U.S. sailors attacked young Mexicans on the streets. During the 1950s, Eisenhower, famous for avoiding social issues, also avoided the topic of immigration. However, he did take action in 1954 with Operation Wetback, where he rounded up 1 million illegal Mexicans and returned them to Mexico. In the 1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs called for protection of many immigrant rights, as programs like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission brought an end to racial discrimination in the workplace. By the 1980s, more than 1 million people a year were moving into the United States, a large portion of them illegal. Under Reagan, the New Right conservatives challenged illegal immigration. The Immigration Reform Act of 1986 sought to penalize the employers of illegal aliens, though with little success. During the 1990s, the state of California made attempts to restrict the education and benefits of the quickly rising illegal population. As we head into the future, the issue of illegal immigration remains an extremely debated topic, and the fate of the huge foreign population in America remains in question.